Picture this: a name once carved into stone, whispered in royal courts, and etched into the annals of power, deliberately scratched away. Imagine a queen who commanded armies, brokered peace, and shaped the fate of empires, only to vanish from history's pages by the hands of those who feared her legacy. This isn't fiction. It's the fate of countless women whose stories were erased, their voices silenced by time and tradition. But today, we're pulling back the veil on these hidden lives, uncovering the power, the struggle, and the indelible mark left by women the ancient world tried to forget. Think about the history you were taught. How many women's names do you remember? For every Cleopatra or Nefertiti, there are dozens more whose achievements were buried under layers of dust and dismissal. These women weren't just footnotes, they were rulers, scholars, healers, and rebels who defied the limits of their time. They negotiated treaties, led rebellions, and built empires, only to have their contributions minimized or erased entirely. Why? Because history, as we know it, was written by those who held the pen, and too often they chose to omit the women who held the power. So what happens when we piece together these fragments of forgotten lives? We discover a tapestry of resilience and ingenuity that redefines our understanding of the past. This video is a journey into the shadows of antiquity, where we'll meet the queens erased from inscriptions, the priestesses scratched off temple walls, and the philosophers whose words were attributed to men. Together, we'll explore how these women navigated a world stacked against them, and how their legacies, though suppressed, still echo through the centuries. Their stories aren't just history. They're a testament to what happens when we dare to look beyond the surface and listen for the voices history tried to silence. Ready to uncover the truth? Let's begin. Power in the ancient world wasn't just about crowns and conquest. It was a delicate dance of influence, often played out in the shadows. For women, the rules were different. In societies where public authority was reserved for men, they had to forge their own paths to power, bending traditions without breaking them. Take Hatshepsut, the woman who ruled Egypt not as queen but as pharaoh. She didn't just wear the crown, she reimagined it, commissioning statues that depicted her with the traditional beard and kilt of a male ruler, a brilliant act of political theater that legitimized her reign. But even she couldn't escape the backlash centuries later. Her monuments were defaced, her name chiseled away in an attempt to erase her from history. Then there were the priestesses of Mesopotamia, women who held sway not through armies but through the gods. In the temple of Ishtar, high priestesses like Enheduanna History's first named author wielded power as interpreters of divine will. Her hymns weren't just prayers, they were political tools uniting city-states under the authority of the goddess she served. And in Greece, the Oracle of Delphi sat at the crossroads of myth and reality, her prophecies shaping wars and alliances. Kings and generals would travel for miles to kneel before her, not because she commanded soldiers, but because her words carried the weight of Apollo himself. Yet for every woman who climbed to the heights of influence, there were countless others working behind the scenes: diplomats like the Hittite queen Pujuhepa, who negotiated treaties on equal footing with foreign kings, or the merchant women of Assyria, whose trade networks funded empires. Their power wasn't always carved in stone, but it was no less real. What's striking is how often these women turned supposed weaknesses into strengths. Denied the sword, they mastered the pen. Barred from the throne, they ruled through faith, finance, or sheer force of intellect. But here's the contradiction. The same societies that sidelined women also relied on them. A kingdom might dismiss female rulers as unnatural until a crisis demanded the steady hand of a queen. Temples might exclude women from priesthoods unless the gods demanded their voices. This tension between perception and reality is where their stories become most fascinating, because when we look closely, we see that ancient power wasn't a monolith, it was a mosaic, and women found their place in every piece. So what does this tell us? That history's great men narrative is incomplete. Behind every pharaoh, emperor, or conqueror, there were women pulling levers of power in ways we're only beginning to uncover. And sometimes the most enduring influence isn't the kind that shouts from monuments, it's the kind that lingers in the quiet spaces between the lines. While Cleopatra and Nefertiti dominate modern imaginations, history's archives hide a gallery of formidable women who ruled with brilliance and were nearly erased for it. Consider the Kushite warrior queens of Nubia like Ammonionas, who led armies against Rome itself. Blind in one eye but unparalleled in strategy, she didn't just resist Emperor Augustus, she forced him into negotiations, securing a treaty that spared her kingdom from conquest. Yet Roman historians barely mentioned her, framing the conflict as a clash between emperors, not a battle against a queen who refused to kneel. Then there's Theodora of Byzantium, a former actress who rose from Constantinople's theaters to the imperial throne. In a society where women were expected to whisper, she roared, drafting laws to protect widows, outlawing forced prostitution, and even saving her husband's reign during the Nika riots. When advisors urged Emperor Justinian to flee, Theodora famously declared, "Purple makes a fine shroud," convincing him to stand his ground. Her political genius reshaped an empire, yet later chroniclers reduced her to a scandalous past or credited Justinian alone for her reforms. These rulers shared a common playbook for survival in male-dominated courts. Some, like the Pomeranian queen Zenobia, adopted the trappings of masculinity, leading troops in armor while carefully presenting herself as heir to Cleopatra's legacy. Others, like the Trung sisters of Vietnam, fused military prowess with spiritual authority, rallying rebels under the banner of ancestral goddesses. Their tactics were as diverse as their cultures, but the backlash was eerily similar. After their deaths, inscriptions were altered, records corrected to shift credit to male relatives, and their stories relegated to myth. The most insidious erasure wasn't just omission, it was reassignment. Take Queen Artemisia of Caria, whose naval brilliance at Salamis was later attributed to the Persian king Xerxes, or Queen Siondiok of Silla, whose astronomical observatory was claimed as her male successor's innovation. Even when women built, governed, or conquered, history's editors often handed their achievements to men, sometimes centuries later, as if polishing the past into a more acceptable narrative. Yet traces remain, like cracks in a fresco where the original paint peeks through. A shattered statue here, a diplomatic letter there, enough to prove these women didn't just exist, they excelled. Their stories force us to ask, how many more Artemisias or Ammoniases are still waiting in the shadows? And what does it mean that we've been taught to see ancient power as exclusively male, when the evidence screams otherwise? The truth isn't lost, it's been buried. And with every fragment we unearth, the past becomes less familiar but far more fascinating. In the hushed sanctuaries of ancient temples, women held a power no king could ignore: the voice of the divine. Take the Pythia of Delphi, seated atop her tripod, breathing in sacred vapors as rulers and generals hung on her every word. When Croesus asked whether to invade Persia, her cryptic reply, "A great empire will fall," sealed his fate. He assumed it meant Persia's downfall, not his own. Her prophecies weren't just spiritual guidance, they were geopolitical chess moves steering the course of nations. Yet for all her influence, the Pythia couldn't own property or vote in Athenian assemblies. Here lies the paradox. The same culture that silenced women in public life trembled before their sacred utterances. Rome's Vestal virgins wielded similar contradictions. Chosen as young girls, they tended the eternal flame of Vesta, a duty so vital that letting it die could bring disaster upon the empire. In return, they enjoyed privileges unheard of for Roman women, testifying in court without oath, pardoning condemned prisoners, and managing vast estates. Their bodies were inviolable. Harming one was punishable by death, but this reverence came with brutal strings. If a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, she was buried alive in a subterranean chamber with only a loaf of bread and a lamp. The message was clear. Their power was sacred but conditional, a gift that could be snatched away. Across the Mediterranean, priestesses like the Hierai of Eleusis guarded mysteries so potent that initiates, including emperors, faced death for revealing them. These women orchestrated rituals that promised salvation, their authority unchallenged within temple walls. Yet step outside, and they became ordinary citizens again, subject to the same laws that barred women from politics. Even in death, the double standard lingered. The grave of a high priestess in Anatolia boasts of her piety, but her name is conspicuously absent, honored, yet anonymized. What made these roles so transformative wasn't just their spiritual weight, but their subversion of norms. A Vestal's inheritance rights undermined patriarchal finance. Pythia's prophecies overrode military strategy. For brief, luminous moments, women stood at the intersection of heaven and earth, their voices amplified by the gods themselves. But always the boundaries were drawn. Their influence was divine, not human, a loophole that allowed societies to revere them without upending the status quo. This tension between sanctity and suppression reveals a truth ancient leaders understood all too well. When women spoke with the authority of the divine, even empires had to listen. Yet that same power had to be contained, ritualized, made exceptional lest it inspire others to demand more. The priestesses and oracles remind us that autonomy, when granted, was often a cage gilded with gold. Their stories aren't just about religion, they're about the fragile bargains women struck to claim space in a world determined to keep them small. Beyond the palaces and temples, in the bustling markets and quiet workshops of the ancient world, women kept civilizations running with their hands and wits. Take Mesopotamia, where clay tablets from the city of Sippar reveal something extraordinary. Women like Iltoni, who ran her own textile business, negotiating contracts and managing a team of weavers. These weren't side ventures, they were the backbone of trade. Her seal, pressed into wet clay beside deals for wool and dyes, proves she wasn't just participating in the economy, she was shaping it. And she wasn't alone. From Assyria to Anatolia, business records show women brewing beer, lending silver, and trading lapis lazuli across continents. Their signatures on tablets force us to rewrite the old assumption that ancient women were confined to the home. Then there's the Indus Valley, where tiny stone weights and bead-making tools found in homes suggest women weren't just crafting jewelry, they were calibrating commerce. The uniformity of these weights hints at a standardized system, one where women likely played a role in maintaining trade precision. And in Egypt, medical papyri list remedies attributed to female healers, their knowledge of herbs and anatomy rivaling temple physicians. A scroll from Kahan even details gynecological treatments, evidence that women treated women, their expertise passed down outside formal institutions. But here's the twist: while these women powered economies, their status was precarious. A Babylonian widow might inherit her husband's shop, but without male relatives, she'd face legal hurdles to keep it. A Hittite potter could sell her wares at market, yet her profits might be controlled by a brother or uncle. The labor was theirs, the credit often wasn't. Even in death, the disparity showed. Compare the lavish tomb of an elite woman to the humble grave of a weaver. Same city, same era, worlds apart in recognition. Archaeology whispers their struggles in broken loom weights and worn grinding stones. The repetitive stress injuries found on female skeletons tell us work was relentless. A woman in Mohenjo-Daro might have spent her life bent over a grinding slab, her vertebrae fused from labor that fed a city but earned no glory. Yet resilience flickers in the details, a child's toy buried with a merchant in Ur, suggesting she balanced motherhood and commerce, or a healer's kit in Crete filled with carefully sorted herbs, her knowledge defying the notion that science belonged to men. Why does this matter? Because history's spotlight on queens and priestesses has left these women in shadow, their contributions framed as mundane when they were anything but. The bread they baked, the cloth they wove, the medicines they mixed, these weren't just chores. They were acts of ingenuity that built the scaffolding of civilization. And when we recognize that, the ancient world doesn't just look different, it feels different. Suddenly, every cracked tablet signed by a woman becomes a revolutionary act, a quiet defiance of the idea that her work didn't count. Ancient law codes carved in stone tell one story, but the cracks between the lines reveal another. Take Hammurabi's famous laws, etched in Babylon nearly 4,000 years ago. On the surface, they read like a script for control. A woman could be drowned for adultery, while her male counterpart faced no penalty. A wife's hair could be shorn as punishment for speaking out of turn. Yet dig deeper, and you'll find something astonishing: loopholes women used to carve out agency. For instance, if a husband abandoned his wife without cause, she could remarry freely. If he tried to sell her into slavery, the law voided the marriage entirely, granting her freedom. These weren't just protections, they were escape hatches, cleverly woven into the system by women who refused to be powerless. Now contrast this with Egypt, where legal scrolls show a startling divergence. A woman in Thebes could inherit land, sue in court, and even stipulate in her marriage contract that her husband couldn't take a second wife without her consent. Papyri from Der el-Medina record disputes where women like Nonak disinherited children who neglected her in old age, her will enforced by local magistrates. But even here, the double standard lurked. A man's adultery was a misdemeanor, a woman's could mean death. The law giveth, and the law taketh away, but not without a fight. Consider the court records from Nippur, where a widow named Beltani petitioned judges to stop her brother-in-law from seizing her late husband's estate. The law technically allowed his claim, but Beltani didn't back down. She produced witnesses proving her husband had legally adopted her as his heir before his death, a rare but brilliant maneuver. The judges ruled in her favor, a verdict preserved on a crumbling tablet. Or take the case of Taram Kubai, an Assyrian merchant's wife who sued her own brother for embezzling her dowry. Despite laws favoring male kin, her detailed accounts on clay tablets down to the last handful of barley won her restitution. These stories expose a truth far more interesting than dry legal codes. Women weren't just passive subjects of ancient laws, they were strategists exploiting every ambiguity to protect their futures. In Rome, the Vestal virgins used their sacred status to bypass inheritance restrictions, amassing fortunes that funded public works. In Athens, where women couldn't own property, some funneled wealth through male proxies or donated to temples, ensuring their gold served causes they believed in. But let's be clear, this wasn't empowerment as we understand it today. Every victory came at a cost, every loophole a hard-won battle against systems designed to keep women dependent. The resilience required to navigate these constraints was staggering. Imagine the mental calculus of a Phoenician merchant's daughter, studying her father's contracts not out of curiosity, but necessity, knowing one misstep could leave her destitute. Picture the Egyptian widow rehearsing her speech before judges, aware that her son's future hinged on her ability to quote precedent perfectly. What emerges isn't a tale of oppression alone, but of ingenuity under pressure. These women didn't rewrite the laws, they learned to read them better than anyone expected. And in doing so, they left us a lesson etched not in stone, but in the spaces between the letters. Even the most rigid systems have flex points if you know where to push. In the hushed scriptoria of antiquity, where knowledge was guarded like treasure, a handful of women shattered the silence not with swords but with words. Consider Enheduanna, the Akkadian high priestess whose hymns to the goddess Inanna weren't just prayers. They were the first signed poetry in history, her name etched into clay tablets 23 centuries before Sappho. Her verses pulsed with raw power. "You flash like lightning over the land," she wrote, claiming a voice so bold it echoes across 4,000 years. Yet for every Enheduanna, there were countless scribes whose hands copied texts, but whose names were deemed unworthy of record. Then there's Hypatia of Alexandria, the philosopher who walked the razor's edge of intellect in a city simmering with religious strife. In an era when most women were barred from academies, she taught mathematics and astronomy to eager students, Christian and pagan alike, her lectures dissecting the cosmos with a clarity that drew death threats. Her crime, not her gender alone, but the audacity to wield reason in an age increasingly hostile to free thought. The mob that flayed her alive with pottery shards didn't just kill a woman, they tried to erase the very idea that a female mind could illuminate the universe's secrets. But resistance flickered in unexpected places. In Tang Dynasty China, courtesan poets like Yu Xuanji composed verses so sharp they cut through the patronizing praise of male contemporaries. "I scorn the peach blossoms that chase the east wind," she wrote, mocking societal expectations with ink-stained fingers. Across the sea, the Japanese noblewoman Murasaki Shikabu penned the tale of Genji, often called the world's first novel, while ladies in waiting around her embroidered silks in silence. Her protagonist, Genji, may have been male, but the psychological depth of her female characters revealed an intimacy with inner lives most male authors of her time ignored. What's striking isn't just their achievements, but the barriers they circumvented. In Greece, where formal education was a male privilege, Sappho's lyric poetry thrived on Lesbos, her school for young women becoming a byword for artistic and intellectual cultivation. In medieval Baghdad, the mathematician Sutata al-Mahamili checked the calculations of judges in her father's court, her expertise in algebra bending the ear of the caliph himself. These women didn't wait for doors to open, they slipped through cracks in the system, leveraging family connections, religious roles, or sheer brilliance to claim their place in the Republic of Letters. Their works betray a hunger deeper than fame. When the Byzantine princess Anna Komnene wrote the Alexiad, her epic history of her father's reign, she didn't just chronicle wars, she dissected military strategy with the precision of a general, then paused to mourn the lost manuscripts of female scholars burned by crusaders. "The ashes mixed with our tears," she lamented, a reminder that every scroll destroyed was a voice extinguished. This tension between creation and erasure, between the thirst for knowledge and the forces that sought to damn it, shaped their legacies. So why does their survival matter? Because each recovered fragment proves that the intellectual history we inherited is a palimpsest, its original layers scraped away to fit someone else's narrative. When Hypatia's students smuggled her treatises out of burning libraries, when Enheduanna's hymns were copied by scribes who didn't dare omit her name, they left us a map not just of what was lost, but of what might have been. And in that map, we find the most subversive truth of all, that the mind has no gender and curiosity, once ignited, refuses to be quenched. Paintbrushes dipped in crushed malachite and ochre, these were the weapons of Minoan women who adorned the walls of Knossos with leaping dolphins and saffron-gathering priestesses. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, where art glorified male rulers, Minoan frescoes celebrated women as central figures, bare-breasted and commanding, presiding over rituals and games. Yet centuries later, when Arthur Evans reconstructed these paintings, he labeled them Prince of the Lilies, assuming the figure must be male. It took decades for scholars to correct the record, revealing how even the act of rediscovery could obscure women's creative legacies. Roman noblewomen took a different tack. When direct power eluded them, they became cultural architects. Take Eumatia of Pompeii, a wealthy widow who funded the city's public portico, a gathering place for merchants and politicians. Her name, chiseled above the entrance, was no humble donation plaque. It was a political statement in marble. Or Julia Domna, Syrian-born empress who turned her salon into a hub for philosophers, ensuring their works praised her son's reign while subtly shaping imperial ideology. These women understood something revolutionary. If history wouldn't record their voices, they'd embed themselves in the stone and scrolls of the civilization they helped build. Art's greatest illusion wasn't perspective. It was the gap between how women were depicted and how they lived. Greek vases showed demure maidens with downcast eyes, yet excavation receipts from Athens list female potters like Cora, who signed her work boldly. Byzantine icons idealized saintly submission, while real women like the Mosaicist Irene left signatures in tesserae beneath altars, their hands shaping sacred images even as the church preached silence. The contradiction was glaring. Cultures that silenced women-in-law elevated them in art, as muses, goddesses, allegories. But when a real woman picked up a chisel or brush, she became an anomaly to be erased or anonymized. Then there are the artifacts that bypassed the male gaze entirely. In Viking graves, the tools of female artisans' bone needles, weaving tablets were buried alongside swords, their craftsmanship valued as highly as warfare. A Mycenaean fresco fragment shows women driving chariots, a scene so at odds with later Greek norms that early archaeologists dismissed it as fantasy. And in China's Tang dynasty, court ladies' burial dolls wore trousers and rode horses, their liberated poses belying Confucian texts that preached domestic confinement. These fragments form a counter-narrative to official history, a Mesopotamian cylinder seal carved with a female scribe's name, a Celtic torque stamped by a metalsmith who signed with a feminine glyph, a Coptic tapestry woven with hidden symbols by nuns resisting patriarchal doctrine. Each one whispers that women weren't just subjects of art, but its creators and commissioners. Their legacy survives not in grand chronicles, but in the cobalt swirl of a fresco, the weight of a patron's ring, the stubborn persistence of pigment on plaster. When words failed them, color and stone spoke louder. A skeleton laid to rest with a sword, shield, and 2 war horses. This wasn't the grave of a Viking warlord, but a woman buried with full warrior honors in Budica, Sweden. For over a century, archaeologists assumed the elaborate 10th century burial belonged to a man. The artifacts spoke of battle prowess, and the bias of the time couldn't reconcile such a role with femininity. Then, in 2017, DNA analysis shattered that assumption. The bones revealed an X chromosome, not a Y. Here lay concrete proof that Viking women weren't just weaving sails, they were steering ships into battle. This revelation wasn't an isolated fluke. Across Europe and beyond, burial sites are forcing us to rewrite history. In the Altai Mountains, a Scythian woman's grave held not just jewelry, but a quiver of arrows and a battle axe, her legs bowed from a lifetime on horseback. DNA confirmed her lineage matched descriptions of the feared Amazons Greek historians dismissed as myth. Even further east, the remains of a high-status Shang dynasty woman in China were found surrounded by bronze weapons, her tomb rivaling those of male generals. These weren't anomalies, they were patterns we'd overlooked because our lens was clouded by centuries of gendered assumptions. The challenge lies in deciphering what graves truly signify. A spindle wall buried with a woman might suggest domesticity until you learn Celtic chieftainesses used them as symbols of authority, their threads metaphorically weaving the fate of their people. A necklace could be mere adornment, or, like the amber amulets found in Anglo-Saxon graves, a mark of a healer's sacred calling. The problem isn't just missing records, it's that surviving texts often reflect the biases of literate male elites, while graves preserve the choices of the deceased and their communities. Modern science is cutting through these layers of misinterpretation. Isotope analysis now traces the life stories etched into bones, like the Viking woman whose teeth showed she'd traveled from Scandinavia to England and back, her skeleton bearing healed battle wounds. Protomics, the study of ancient proteins, recently identified a high-status Minoan burial on Crete as female, despite the absence of DNA, by detecting traces of a pregnancy-related hormone in the dental plaque. Even the positioning of bodies tells tales. A woman buried with a gaming set in Norway was laid to rest sitting upright, a posture reserved for respected strategists. Yet every breakthrough exposes how much we've missed. Take the case of the Burqa warrior. Had she been excavated today, her identity might have been clear from the start. But because early archaeologists catalogued her as male without question, her story was nearly lost. Now, museums are re-examining old finds with fresh eyes, discovering that princes were priestesses, hunters were healers, and servants were scholars. What emerges is a world far more complex than the one we were taught. These silent witnesses in the dirt refuse to fit neatly into boxes labeled masculine or feminine. They force us to ask, how many other histories have we misread because we assumed we already knew the plot? The answer lies not in the grand narratives of kings and conquests, but in the quiet evidence of bones, beads, and the occasional glorious sword. When the Roman legions marched into Britannia, they expected to crush tribes, not a queen leading 60,000 warriors in a chariot crowned with blades. Budica's revolt wasn't just a military campaign, it was an inferno. She burned Camulogenum to the ground, reduced Londinium to ash, and left a trail of broken helmets in her wake. Yet Roman historians like Tacitus painted her as a madwoman, her fury framed as grief gone monstrous. Never mind that her people had been flogged, her daughters assaulted, her rage was pathologized, her strategy reduced to hysterics. The same pen that praised Caesar's tactics as genius dismissed hers as the flailing of an unhinged widow. Half a world away, the Trung sisters of Vietnam faced similar distortions. When they raised an army against Chinese invaders in the 1st century, their rebellion was a masterclass in guerrilla warfare, flooding valleys to trap cavalry, rallying peasants and nobles alike under banners embroidered with golden phoenixes. For 3 years, they held territory, even establishing a short-lived matriarchal court. But later dynastic records recast their defiance as tragic folly, their final stand at the Hat River framed not as strategic retreat, but as a theatrical suicide, 2 women leaping into water rather than facing capture. The message was clear: when women won, it was luck; when they lost, it was destiny. What's striking isn't just the bias in these accounts, but the pattern. Across cultures, women who resisted were either sanitized into symbols or demonized as aberrations. Take Artemisia I of Halicarnassus, the naval commander who outmaneuvered the Greeks at Salamis. Herodotus praised her tactical brilliance until he implied her success stemmed from unnatural masculine traits. Even Joan of Arc's sainthood couldn't fully erase the original verdict. Her battlefield visions were first condemned as witchcraft, her cross-dressing as perversion. The template was consistent credit their victories to divine intervention, madness, or male advisors, but never to their own intellect. Yet these rebellions weren't outliers. Scroll through the margins of history, and you'll find a shadow network of resistance. The Celtic queen Cartimandua used diplomatic marriages to shield her people from Rome, only to be branded a traitor when she prioritized survival over bloodshed. In Ethiopia, Queen Giudet toppled the Aksumite dynasty, her reign so feared that monks later claimed she was possessed by demons. The price of defiance wasn't just death, it was erasure. Their motives scrubbed clean of political calculation and recast as emotional outbursts or supernatural whims. But here's what the archives miss. These women weren't rebels without causes. Boudicca's war followed the Roman confiscation of ancestral lands, a financial stranglehold, not just personal vengeance. The Trung sisters' uprising erupted after the Han dynasty imposed taxes so brutal families sold children into slavery. Their battles weren't vanity projects, they were last stands against systems designed to break them. And when they lost, the backlash was pedagogical. Rome paraded Boudicca's defeat as proof that barbarians, especially female ones, couldn't govern. China used the Trung's fall to justify tighter control over Vietnamese women's movements. Crushing the rebellion was only step one. Rewriting it as inevitable was step two. The most insidious myth of all, that these women were lone exceptions in a sea of docile subjects. Dig deeper and you'll find the unnamed, the slave who poisoned her master's wine in Pompeii, the peasant girls who smuggled blades to the Trung armies, the British women who sharpened stakes for Boudicca's trenches. Their collective resistance whispers the truth. What we call anomalies were often movements, their stories pruned until only a single, manageable figure remained. The real question isn't why so few women rebelled, but why we've been taught to see their defiance as solitary sparks in the dark, when the tinder was everywhere. Marriage in the ancient world was never just a union of hearts, it was a merger of armies, a balancing of ledgers, a chess move in the game of empires. Cleopatra understood this better than most. When she first met Julius Caesar, she didn't arrive with flowers. She arrived rolled in a carpet, a literal and metaphorical unveiling of her most potent weapon, alliance through intimacy. Her subsequent marriages to both Caesar and Mark Antony weren't romantic whims. They were calculated bids to position Egypt as the indispensable power broker between Rome's warring factions. Through these unions, she secured military support, cancelled debts, and even temporarily preserved her kingdom's independence. Yet history remembers her liaisons as scandalous affairs, reducing her political genius to seduction. The truth, she played the same game as every monarch of her era. She just did it while the world insisted on framing her body, not her mind, as the instrument of power. But for every Cleopatra weaving dynastic webs, there were countless women whose marriages were transactions they didn't negotiate. In Han Dynasty China, a peasant girl might be married off at 12 to a man 3 times her age, her value measured in bushels of grain or bolts of silk. Confucian laws framed this as cosmic harmony, but the bamboo slips excavated from desert tombs tell another story. Letters from brides begging fathers to intervene, or wills where mothers pleaded to spare daughters from marriages that had broken them. Even elite women faced rigid constraints. A Tang dynasty edict forbade widows from remarrying not out of piety, but to keep family wealth concentrated in male hands. The contrast couldn't be sharper. Queens married to map borders, commoners married to erase them. Dowries crystallized this imbalance. In ancient Athens, a woman's dowry was legally her husband's property, yet it functioned as a leash. If he divorced her, he had to return it, making separation financially ruinous. Babylonian brides fared slightly better. Their Ketaba contracts guaranteed repayment of the dowry in widowhood, but only if male relatives didn't contest it. The loopholes were endless. A Roman woman might bring vast estates to her marriage, yet under the manor system, her husband could sell them without her consent. These weren't just financial arrangements, they were cages with golden bars, designed to keep wealth circulating among men while women served as its temporary vessels. Yet some women turned the system against itself. The Visigothic queen Brunhilde used successive marriages to rule Francia for decades, outmaneuvering kings who underestimated her. In Byzantium, Empress Irene seized the throne after her husband's death by strategically remarrying, then promptly eliminating her new spouse to rule alone. Even in restrictive societies, divorce could be a lifeline. Egyptian women retained the right to initiate splits, citing abuse or neglect in petitions preserved on papyrus. One such document from Deir el-Medina features a wife's blistering indictment of her husband. "He is like a broken sandal, useless and hurting my feet." Her words, scrawled in hieratic script, echo across millennia as a rare testament of defiance. The cruelest irony: the same societies that framed marriage as women's ultimate purpose often denied them its protections. A Spartan wife might raise warriors for the state, but her children were legally her father's property. A Hindu widow in the Gupta Empire could be pressured onto her husband's funeral pyre, her worth expiring with him. These weren't cultural quirks, they were systemic tools to ensure women's labor, fertility, and loyalty remained under male control. But look closer and cracks appear in the facade. The Vindolanda tablets from Roman Britain reveal military wives running supply networks for distant forts. A cache of letters from Mongol noblewomen shows them negotiating marriages not just for alliances, but to secure trade routes. Even the most oppressive systems had pressure points, and women learned to exploit them, because behind every treaty marriage or arranged union, there was a private calculus. A woman weighing survival against autonomy, learning to wield influence in a world that gave her little room to breathe. Their stories remind us that the personal was always political, long before the phrase existed, and sometimes the quietest rebellions left the deepest marks. In ancient Rome, motherhood was both a woman's civic duty and her most precarious tightrope walk. The Julian laws of 18 BC rewarded freeborn women who bore 3 or more children with the ius trium liberorum legal autonomy over their finances, a rare taste of independence in a society where husbands typically controlled a wife's assets. But the fine print was brutal. Infants deemed weak or deformed could be abandoned on hillsides without penalty, and adulterous mothers faced exile or death. Fertility wasn't just celebrated, it was weaponized, a tool to replenish the empire's legions and workshops while punishing women who strayed from the script. Even the goddess Juno, protector of childbirth, carried a double-edged symbolism. Her epithet Lucina meant she who brings children into the light, but her festivals also included rituals to cleanse women of the stain of miscarriage. Sparta took this paradox to extremes. While Athenian women wove wool in seclusion, their Spartan counterparts trained in athletics to bear stronger sons, but only if eugenics councils approved their unions. Plutarch recounts how older husbands would loan their wives to younger men for breeding, and sickly infants were left in the Taygetus Mountains. The state's obsession with warrior offspring turned women's bodies into public resources, their wombs treated like fertile fields to be sown for harvest. Yet fragments of poetry scratched on pottery shards hint at the emotional toll. One Spartan mother's lament for a son fallen in battle reads simply, "You were swift in life, now even the earth cannot hold you." The medical texts of the time reveal how much invisible labor fell to mothers and how little credit they received. The Trotula, a 12th century compendium of women's medicine compiled in Salerno, Italy, preserves centuries of midwives' knowledge, recipes to ease childbirth pain with poppy and henbane, warnings against tight swaddling that could stunt growth, even psychological advice for melancholic mothers after difficult deliveries. But the male physicians who transcribed this wisdom often erased its origins, attributing breakthroughs to theoretical male authorities. A remedy for mastitis might be credited to Hippocratic principles, ignoring the grandmothers who'd passed it down for generations. The gap between ideal and reality yawned widest in mortality rates. Egyptian census records from Roman times show that up to a third of children died before age 10, their mothers burying them in reed coffins with tiny amulets still clutched in their hands. A papyrus letter from a grieving mother in Oxyrhynchus pleads with the god Serapis, "You took my firstborn, must you take the last one too?" Yet public art depicted motherhood as serene and effortless, like the famous core statues of smiling women holding infants, their marble faces unlined by sleepless nights or loss. Matrilineal societies offered a stark counterpoint. Among the Kosi of India or the Minangkabau of Indonesia, lineage flowed through mothers, not fathers. Cherokee clans traced ancestry through the beloved women who selected war chiefs and vetoed battles. These cultures weren't utopias. Women still shouldered disproportionate caregiving, but they proved that patriarchy wasn't inevitable. When a Berber queen like Dihia led resistance against Arab invaders in the 7th century, or a Juchite grandmother in Mexico passed down communal lands to her daughters, they were upholding systems where motherhood meant authority, not just obligation. The bittersweet truth, even in the most oppressive regimes, children remained women's secret leverage. A Roman matron might use her son's political career to sway policy. An enslaved wet nurse in Babylon could negotiate better treatment by bonding with her master's heir. The very vulnerability that made motherhood a shackle also made it a fulcrum, one that generations of women learned to pivot with quiet, world-altering skill. The bustling ports of ancient Tyre tell a story most history books skip: the story of women like Tabnet, a Phoenician merchant whose name appears on shipping manifests beside cargoes of purple dye and Lebanese cedar. Her ledgers, pressed into clay tablets around 700 BCE, detail transactions spanning from Cyprus to Carthage, proving she wasn't just a silent partner, but a force in the Mediterranean's most lucrative trade network. Yet scroll through Greek accounts of Phoenicia, and you'll find her peers dismissed as traders' wives or worse, their wealth chalked up to husbands' generosity rather than their own shrewd negotiations. Athenian heterae faced a similar paradox. These elite courtesans weren't just companions, they were entrepreneurs. Take Archinassa, whose fees for philosophical debates with powerful men funded her own property purchases. A scandal in a city where respectable women couldn't even leave home without male escorts. Court records show she sued a client for unpaid fees and won, her contract upheld despite societal sneers. Meanwhile, in the Agora, women like Norsamash ran perfume shops, their account books revealing deals with foreign suppliers and loans to male customers. Their economic clout was undeniable, yet playwrights mocked them as gold diggers, their independence framed as moral failing. The vilification had a purpose. When women controlled wealth, they threatened the system. In Babylon, The Nadatu priestesses of Sippar, barred from marriage but permitted to trade, used their temple connections to build real estate empires. Their cuneiform contracts show purchases of orchards, rental properties, and even slavery disputes. But law codes warned against doing business with them. Their financial acumen spun as manipulation. Even in death, the bias followed them. A Nadatu's will might leave silver to nieces, only to have male relatives contest it by claiming she'd been tricked into unfair terms. Wealth brought power and peril. The Roman businesswoman Eumatia of Pompeii funded her city's largest public building, her name chiseled into its marble facade. Yet when Vesuvius erupted, archaeologists found her statue decapitated, possibly vandalized by rivals who resented her prominence. Similarly, Chinese silk merchant Liang Hongyu's fortune bankrolled anti-Jin rebellion armies in the 12th century, earning her a general's title until court historians recast her as a seductress who bewitched soldiers into loyalty. The receipts don't lie. From Delos Island, where women's names appear on shipping loans, to Aksumite Ethiopia, where merchant queens minted coins with their profiles, the evidence stacks up. These women weren't exceptions. They were the rule in economies that relied on their labor while denying them credit. Their ledgers, contracts, and lawsuits form a shadow history of capitalism's origins, one where the purse strings were often in hands the textbooks ignore. And that's the real scandal, not that women profited, but that their profits proved how flimsy the excuses for excluding them really were. The whip scars on the back of a woman buried in the Roman necropolis of Ostia tell a silent story, one of bodies turned into currency. In Sumer, temple inventories listed enslaved women alongside livestock and grain, their prices calculated by age and health. A cuneiform tablet from Lagash records the sale of a weaver named Jim Ninlilla for 12 shekels of silver, the cost of 3 donkeys. These weren't just transactions, they were erasures, reducing human lives to columns in ledger books. Resistance flickered in the margins. A papyrus from Ptolemaic Egypt preserves the desperate plea of a woman named Hermione, who'd fled her master's abuse. "If I am forced to return, I will throw myself into the Nile." The document is a rare manumission contract bought by her brother at great cost. In Rome, the slave-born philosopher and playwright Herzvitha of Gandersheim later recounted how Christian women secretly purchased enslaved girls to spare them from brothels, though such acts were drops in an ocean of exploitation. The intersection of gender and class tightened the chains. An enslaved woman in Athens might grind grain 14 hours a day, while her elite mistress embroidered in shaded courtyards, both bound by patriarchy, but worlds apart in suffering. Viking thralls taken from Slavic villages faced dual burdens: fieldwork by day, sexual servitude by night. Even freedom wasn't equal. When the Babylonian slave Boudicca earned her manumission, her certificate stipulated she couldn't open a tavern, a trade reserved for men. Yet archaeology uncovers glimmers of defiance. The ruins of Pompeii's brothel reveal names like Amaryllis and Restituta scratched into walls, perhaps marking their presence in a system that denied them identity. In Carthage, a burial site held an enslaved child buried with an amulet of Tanit, a goddess of liberation clutched in her small hand. These fragments remind us that oppression was never total. Even in darkness, the human spirit carved out slivers of light, not enough to overthrow the system, but enough to prove it could be cracked. In the dim light of an Egyptian birthing chamber, a woman crouched on bricks engraved with protective spells, each one carved by midwives who knew more about the female body than any temple physician. The Kahun gynecological papyrus, dating back to 1800 BCE, reads like a modern medical manual. Recipes for contraceptives using acacia gum, now known to have spermicidal properties. diagnoses for uterine prolapse, even treatments for postpartum depression with frankincense and myrrh. These weren't guesses, they were the accumulated wisdom of generations of women who'd turned childbirth from a death sentence into an art. Yet centuries later, the same knowledge that saved lives in antiquity would be branded as witchcraft, its practitioners burned or drowned for daring to understand what men feared to study. The suppression didn't happen overnight. In Mesopotamia, the Asutu female healers worked alongside male physicians, their names appearing on cuneiform tablets prescribing everything from wound dressings to labor-inducing teas. A prescription from Mary lists a poultice of tamarisk and beer for mastitis, signed by the healer Shibtu. But as medicine became institutionalized, women were pushed to the margins. By the time of Hippocrates, their role was reduced to midwifery, and even that was suspect. Greek texts like On the Diseases of Women borrowed heavily from female practitioners' knowledge, then framed it as male discovery. The pattern was clear: extract the wisdom, erase the wise. Childbirth itself was a battlefield. Roman tombstones tell brutal truths. She died in her 20th year, in childbirth with her first, a refrain so common it became shorthand for maternal mortality. Yet the same culture that romanticized motherhood offered little practical support. Soranus, a 2nd century physician, warned against letting midwives use birthing chairs, insisting they caused hysteria. Never mind that Egyptian reliefs show these chairs saving countless lives by aligning gravity with anatomy. The disconnect was staggering. Women's bodies were celebrated in poetry, but their survival was left to chance and whispered folk remedies. The witch hunts of medieval Europe completed the erasure. A German midwife's herbal from the 1400s, filled with accurate diagrams of fetal positions, was used as evidence against her at trial. The prosecutor's argument: no uneducated woman could know such things without diabolic aid. What had once been honored as sacred craft became heresy overnight. In England, the cunning women who'd sterilized wounds with moldy bread centuries before penicillin were hanged for charming infections away. The real crime wasn't magic, it was competence outside male control. Yet fragments of their legacy endure. In the ashes of Pompeii, archaeologists found a midwife's kit with bronze specula identical to modern designs. A Byzantine manuscript preserves the formula for a pain-relieving salve invented by the physician Metrodora, whose name was almost scratched from history. Even the word hysteria, derived from the Greek hystera, meaning womb, betrays its origins in male anxiety over women's bodies they couldn't comprehend. Perhaps the greatest irony lies in the spiritual dimensions these healers never separated from science. The Egyptian midwife who recited incantations to Hathor while administering ergot for hemorrhage wasn't mixing superstition with medicine. She was practicing holistic care, addressing fear and faith alongside flesh. When we dismiss these women as witches or primitives, we ignore the truth. Their approach to healing was often more advanced, more humane than the rigid binaries that replaced it. The real mystery isn't how they worked miracles with so little, it's why we're still catching up to what they knew. In the pantheon of ancient Egypt, Isis stood as the epitome of divine femininity, her wings cradling the dead in the afterlife, her magic resurrecting her husband Osiris, her wisdom guiding pharaohs. Temples across the Nile celebrated her as the mother of all, a nurturer who wielded power through healing and protection. Yet just beyond Egypt's borders, in the myths of Mesopotamia, lurked Lilith, the winged demoness who refused to lie beneath Adam, fleeing Eden to become a child-stealing night hag. Two faces of the same coin, one revered, one reviled. What determined whether a woman with power became a goddess or a monster? The answer lies not in their deeds, but in who controlled the stories. This duality wasn't accidental. Societies that exalted maternal deities like Isis or Demeter often did so to reinforce domestic ideals. The Eleusinian mysteries, secret rites honoring Demeter's grief for her daughter Persephone, framed female suffering as sacred, a subtle endorsement of women's acceptance of loss and subjugation. Meanwhile, figures like Lilith or Lamia, women who dared to defy male authority, were twisted into cautionary tales. A Babylonian incantation bowl depicts Lilith with owl claws and serpent hair, her independence recast as a threat to orderly society. The message was clear: step outside your role and you'll be mythologized as a predator rather than a protector. Even within single cultures, the line between worship and fear was razor thin. Take Hathor, the Egyptian cow goddess of love and music. When angered, she transformed into Sekhmet, the lioness who nearly destroyed humanity in a bloodthirsty rampage. Greek hearth goddess Hestia was worshipped for her chastity, while Medusa's sexual assault by Poseidon led to her being cursed with serpent hair, a punishment that turned her into the monster men claimed she always was. These weren't just stories, they were psychological levers, teaching women that their power was safest when it served, never challenged. The echoes linger today. Modern pop culture still dichotomizes women as either nurturing guides or destructive femmes fatales. Think of the Marvel Cinematic Universe's dichotomy between Scarlet Witch's chaos and Black Widow's sacrificial martyrdom. The trope of the crazy ex-girlfriend owes more to Lilith's demonization than we admit, while wellness influencers co-opting goddess energy often strip ancient figures like Isis of their complexity, reducing them to Instagram-friendly slogans. Even politics isn't immune. Female leaders face labels like shrill or hysterical, terms steeped in the same ancient fears that turned autonomous women into monsters. Yet cracks in the narrative are widening. Contemporary retellings like Madeline Miller's Circe or movies like The Northman are resurrecting maligned figures with nuance, asking why societies feared women who refused to kneel. Archaeologists are re-examining which burials like the Czech woman buried with amulets and a wolf-tooth necklace not as outcasts, but as revered healers later slandered by new religious orders. The past isn't just prologue, it's a mirror, and the reflection shows how deeply we've internalized the idea that a woman's power must either comfort or terrify, never simply exist. The real magic lies in breaking that spell. The loom was more than a tool, it was a silent revolution. In the sunlit workshops of Minoan Crete, women wove not just fabric, but the economic backbone of an empire. Their intricate saffron-dyed linens flowed across the Mediterranean, traded for copper, ivory, and amber. These weren't just textiles, they were currency, so valuable that Linear B tablets from Knossos record cloth shipments alongside gold and weapons. Yet the names of the weavers are absent, their hands invisible behind the palace accountants' neat columns of tribute. Half a world away in Viking Scandinavia, the sails powering dragon ships to Newfoundland's shores weren't crafted by warriors, but by women working wool into wind-catching giants. A single sail required the fleece of 200 sheep carded, spun, and woven in a process consuming over 1,000 hours. The Icelandic sagas praise chieftains who crossed oceans, but forget the wives and daughters who made those journeys possible with calloused fingers and backstrap looms. Even in death, the evidence survives. Norse graves of esteemed women often contain whalebone smoothing boards, their edges worn thin from finishing fabric that clothed and funded entire settlements. The dismissal of this labor as women's work reveals a deliberate blindness. In the Andes, Quechua weavers encoded history in kippas knotted textiles carrying census data, treaties, and even poetry. Spanish chroniclers burned most as pagan nonsense, missing the sophistication of a writing system spun from alpaca wool. Similarly, Byzantine silk workshops staffed by women produced patterns so complex they became state secrets, their creators confined to guarded gynaeceums lest they sell techniques to rivals. The very exclusivity of their skills proved how vital and threatening their knowledge was. What makes these threads revolutionary is their stealth. When the Tang dynasty imposed sumptuary laws limiting silk colors to nobility, peasant women stitched rebellious motifs into undergarments, hidden dragons beneath plain tunics. A surviving child's robe from Dunhuang features embroidered mice-nibbling imperial grain, a silent protest against taxes. In medieval Europe, tapestry weavers smuggled heresies into cathedral wall hangings, a fox preaching to geese here, a donkey playing a harp there, each subversion woven safely beneath biblical scenes. The loom's rhythm was a language. West African strip weavers created proverbs in cotton, their patterns saying what speech couldn't under tyrannical rule. A Ghanaian Adinkra cloth stamped with the Jai Nyame symbol, except for God, wasn't just decoration, it was a declaration of resilience. Even the Industrial Revolution's mechanized mills couldn't erase this legacy. The Luddite rebels who smashed power looms in 1811 weren't just men. Women like Hannah Smith led nighttime raids, their anger fueled by generations of seeing their craft reduced to unskilled labor. So why does history insist textiles were trivial? Because acknowledging their worth would unravel the myth that women's contributions were domestic, not economic. A Phoenician merchant's ledger might list a purple-dyed cloak's price, but never the murex shells crushed by a diver's widow to make the dye. A medieval invoice could detail Flemish wool costs without mentioning the abbess who brokered the deal from her convent. The scissors that cut the threads of recognition were wielded not just by men, but by systems that couldn't admit how much they relied on hands they claimed were only good for holding distaffs. Yet in every snip of thread there's defiance. When archaeologists unearth a Minoan spindle wall etched with a snake goddess, or a Viking grave where a woman's brooch pins still hold flecks of sailcloth, they're not just finding tools, they're finding manifestos. The real tapestry isn't on the loom, it's in the stubborn persistence of women who turned every stitch into a sentence, every pattern into a paragraph of a story they refused to let history forget. Few fragments of ancient poetry burn as fiercely as Sappho's verses, surviving the centuries like embers carried on the wind. Like the sweet apple that reddens on the highest branch, she wrote, her words dripping with longing and precision, a woman's voice unapologetically intimate, preserved on crumbling papyrus. That any of her work endures is miraculous. Most of her 9 volumes were burned by medieval clergy who deemed them too dangerous, their sensual depictions of female desire incompatible with the moral order. The scraps we have survived by chance, used as mummy wrappings in Egypt, scribbled as grammar exercises by schoolboys, or quoted by male philosophers who couldn't ignore her genius despite their discomfort. Even Plato, who called her the 10th muse, did so while relegating her to mythological status, a compliment that also erased her humanity. The letters of Roman matrons like Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, reveal a different kind of preservation, one shaped by selective admiration. Her correspondence, praised by Cicero for its noble tone, was carefully curated to showcase republican virtues. The fragments that survive focus on her son's education and political careers, scrubbed clean of personal grief after their violent deaths. What might she have written in private beyond the gaze of male historians? Contrast this with the Vindolanda tablets from Roman Britain, where a woman's hurried scrawl complains about forgotten socks and a dinner invitation, mundane details that humanize her in ways grand narratives never could. The tension between preservation and censorship runs like a fault line through history. Take the diary of Lady Murasaki, whose tale of Genji revolutionized Japanese literature. While her novel was celebrated, her personal journal, with its sharp critiques of court life, was nearly destroyed for its unseemly candor. Similarly, the poems of Enheduanna, the world's first named author, were copied for centuries by scribes who revered her hymns to Inanna, but omitted her autobiographical account of being exiled from Ur. Male editors cherry-picked what fit their vision of womanhood, discarding the rest like chaff. Yet sometimes defiance bled through the cracks. The Egyptian songwriter Eni's advice to her daughter, "Do not trust a brother or friend, keep your own counsel," survived on ostraka shards, its subversive edge intact. In Byzantium, the Princess Anna Komnene's history of her father's reign included veiled jabs at her brother's incompetence, her bitterness seeping through the polished Greek prose. These weren't just words, they were landmines planted in the archive, waiting to detonate assumptions about women's passivity. The fight for recognition wasn't waged alone. Female scribes in medieval convents secretly copied pagan texts alongside psalters, their marginal notes correcting male scholars' errors. A 9th-century manuscript of Sappho's work bears a nun's annotation. Here the parchment was damaged, but the sense is clear. Even in silence, they pushed back. Today, archaeologists using multispectral imaging recover erased undertexts, prayers, recipes, and protests scratched out by later hands. Each restored syllable is a victory, proving that erasure was never total. The past whispers to those willing to listen closely, in the spaces between the official record and the stories women dared to tell when no one was looking. The chisel marks gouging Hatshepsut's cartouches from temple walls tell a story of calculated annihilation. 20 years after her death, workers scaled her towering obelisks at Karnak, methodically hacking away every trace of the woman who dared rule Egypt as pharaoh. Even her statues, those serene faces with the false beard of kingship, were shattered, the fragments buried in pits near Deir el-Bahari. This wasn't random vandalism. It was damnatio memoriae, the ritual erasure of a person from history. The irony, the very effort to destroy her confirms her power. Thutmose Roman III didn't waste energy obliterating minor figures, only those whose legacies truly threatened the new order. Compare this to the Arch of Julia Domna in Rome, still standing proud along the Via Sacra. The Syrian-born empress commissioned this monument to celebrate her son's victories, but her own likeness appears repeatedly alongside the gods. Though later emperors chiseled away her titles, her image remained, perhaps because her influence was too woven into the empire's fabric to fully excise. The difference in treatment reveals a brutal truth. Women who operated within accepted roles might be grudgingly tolerated, but those who shattered ceilings faced posthumous retaliation. The pattern repeats across civilizations. In ancient Caria, Queen Artemisia's naval triumphs were re-inscribed to credit male commanders. Byzantine chroniclers scrubbed Empress Irene's name from official records after she dared to rule in her own right. Yet some slipped through the cracks, like the Kushite queen Amenishakito, whose pyramid at Marae still bears her likeness clutching a sword, untouched because her kingdom lay beyond Rome's reach. Survival often depended on geography as much as politics. Modern archaeology is reversing this erasure, pixel by pixel. At the Temple of Hathor in Dendera, 3D imaging has reconstructed Cleopatra's cartouches from tool marks left by Roman defacers. In Turkey, conservators painstakingly reassemble statues of Cybele, the mother goddess whose worship was suppressed by early Christians. Each restoration is more than technical, it's ideological, forcing us to confront how much history has been edited to fit patriarchal narratives. Yet the work remains fraught. When a team recently proposed reconstructing Hatshepsut's vandalized reliefs with projected light, critics argued it whitewashes the violence of her erasure. Others counter that leaving the damage visible perpetuates the original suppressor's victory. There's no perfect solution, only the obligation to keep questioning why certain women were deemed too dangerous to remember, and why we're still wrestling with their shadows today. Buried beneath layers of dirt and dogma, the past is finally getting a second look, and the discoveries are rewriting history as we know it. Take the Boudicca Viking warrior, her skeleton resting among swords and strategy game pieces for over 1,000 years before DNA testing revealed the truth in 2017. For decades, historians dismissed the idea of female warriors as poetic license in sagas. Now, isotope analysis of her teeth tells a different story. This woman traveled from Scandinavia to Britain and back, her bones bearing healed battle wounds. The backlash was immediate. Some scholars insisted the weapons must have been ceremonial gifts, clinging to old assumptions even as similar graves across Europe, from Norway's Oseberg ship to the Ukrainian steppes, yielded more women buried with axes and armor. Egyptian art is undergoing its own revolution. Take the tomb of Nubia, a dignitary from the 18th dynasty. For years, a fresco beside his sarcophagus was described as showing servants tending to his afterlife needs. But recent high-resolution scans revealed something startling. The figure's delicate wristbands and slender proportions match known depictions of elite women. These weren't anonymous laborers, they were priestesses, their roles downplayed by early Egyptologists who assumed religious authority was male. Even the grand procession scenes at Luxor are being reevaluated. What were once called female musicians now appear to be high-status chantresses conducting sacred rites, their hieroglyphic titles previously mistranslated. The most heated battles, though, are happening over pronouns. Cuneiform tablets from Mari refer to a military commander named Beltum with feminine suffixes, sparking debates about whether she was a singular anomaly or part of a broader tradition we've overlooked. Similarly, Byzantine records of the physician Matrodora alternated between masculine and feminine descriptors until medieval copyists corrected them to male. Even Cleopatra's famed diplomacy is caught in the crossfire Roman accounts that called her he, when discussing statecraft using the formal masculine for rulers, were later misinterpreted as literal gender references, obscuring her political acumen behind gendered language games. What makes these revisions explosive isn't just the new facts, it's the resistance they reveal. When a journal article proposed that 30% of Viking graves with weapons might be female, critics accused researchers of politicizing archaeology. Yet the same scholars rarely questioned assumptions when those graves were automatically labeled male. The double standard is telling. Treating history as unchanging feels safer than admitting how much we've projected our own biases onto the past. This isn't about rewriting history to fit modern values. It's about undoing centuries of selective editing. Every time a conservator restores the original pigments on a Minoan fresco, revealing women presiding over bull-leaping ceremonies, or a linguist deciphers a forgotten feminine title in Linear B tablets, we're not erasing the past. We're recovering it from the people who erased it first, and that's why this moment matters, because history isn't a static monologue handed down from on high. It's a living, breathing argument, one that shapes everything from school curricula to national identities. When we acknowledge that women built civilizations alongside men, we're not just filling gaps in ancient timelines. We're reshaping what power looks like, who gets to claim it, and ultimately, who we believe can change the world today. For centuries, history was written as if half the human race didn't exist, until feminist scholars grabbed the archival equivalent of a chisel and started carving women back into the record. But this wasn't just about adding women and stirring. The real revolution came when historians like Joan Kelly asked a bombshell question in 1977: did women have a renaissance? On the surface, it seemed absurd. Every textbook celebrated the era's artistic and intellectual flourishing. Yet Kelly revealed the dark underbelly. While men like Leonardo da Vinci broke free from medieval constraints, women actually lost ground. Dowry inflation trapped them in marriages, convents swelled with unwilling brides of Christ, and the very humanist ideals that liberated men framed women's virtue as silence and seclusion. The Renaissance wasn't a rebirth for everyone, it was a cage dressed in velvet. This was the seismic shift feminist historiography brought, not merely inserting names into existing narratives, but exposing how those narratives were built on gendered fault lines. Take the French Annals School, which pioneered studying mentalities across centuries, yet somehow omitted how those mentalities treated female bodies as property. Or Marxist history's focus on class struggle, which often ignored how peasant women's unpaid domestic labor propped up entire economies. The problem wasn't just omission, it was methodology. When historian Gerda Lerner excavated Mesopotamian tablets, she didn't just note women's presence, she showed how patriarchy was constructed, layer by legal layer, through marriage contracts and inheritance laws. Suddenly, the past wasn't a fixed timeline but a battleground of competing power structures. The pitfalls of superficial inclusion glare in archaeology. For decades, excavators labeled any grave with weapons as male and those with jewelry as female, until skeletal analysis proved them wrong. Even now, the impulse to balance history by tacking on a few exceptional women risks reducing them to tokens. Helena of Aquitaine gets a cameo, but the millions of medieval women who brewed beer, litigated property disputes, or practiced surgery remain footnotes. Feminist historiography demands more, re-evaluating what counts as significant. A Byzantine silk worker's ledger might lack the drama of a crusade, but its economic ripple effects fed empires. A Native American woman's corn grinding stone wasn't just a tool, it was the foundation of agricultural surplus that built cities. The ethical stakes couldn't be higher. When we reduce women to supporting roles in history's grand drama, we don't just distort the past, we license inequality in the present. Consider how the erasure of female scientists like Hypatia or Trotula fueled the myth that women naturally lack analytical minds. Or how the silencing of enslaved women's resistance narratives like Harriet Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl let racism frame Black women as passive victims. Inclusive storytelling isn't about political correctness. It's about repairing the cognitive dissonance of a history that pretends half its actors weren't there. The tools for this reckoning are multiplying. Digitized nuns' letters reveal networks of political influence hidden in pious correspondence. Laser scans detect erased feminine endings in cuneiform tablets. Even AI is helping reconstruct Sappho's poems from charred papyrus fragments. But technology alone isn't enough. It takes a willingness to sit with discomfort. To admit that our heroes might have oppressed their wives, that universal rights often excluded mothers, and that progress isn't a straight line but a tangled thread pulled taut by countless forgotten hands. The past isn't a monument to preserve, it's a conversation to join. And after centuries of monologue, the chorus of voices finally rising from the archives won't be silenced again. The echoes of antiquity reverberate in our modern boardrooms, legislatures, and protest marches because the battles ancient women fought are startlingly familiar. Consider the pay gap. Today, women earn 84 cents for every dollar a man makes, a disparity that would feel bitterly recognizable to a Babylonian merchant like Iltoni, whose textile profits were legally controlled by male relatives. Or look at political representation, where women hold just 27% of parliamentary seats globally, a statistic that mirrors the exclusion of Roman matrons from the Senate, despite their behind-the-scenes influence. History isn't repeating itself, it's revealing how deeply the roots of inequality run, tangled in the same soil of tradition and power. But here's the crucial difference: we have tools our ancestors lacked. When Hatshepsut's successors chiseled her name from monuments, they relied on stone and chisel's slow, physical erasure. Today's attempts to silence women unfold in algorithms and archives, like Wikipedia edit wars that label female scientists not notable enough, or AI datasets that overlook women's contributions. The mediums have changed, but the motive remains: to shrink women's impact into footnotes. Yet digital spaces also offer unprecedented ways to fight back. Activists are using crowdsourcing to reconstruct lost histories, like the WikiGap campaign adding thousands of women's biographies to Wikipedia, or 3D modeling to virtually restore vandalized statues of queens. The same technology that can erase can also resurrect. The parallels extend to cultural narratives. Just as ancient priestesses had their scientific knowledge rebranded as witchcraft, modern women in STEM face the Matilda effect, where their breakthroughs are attributed to male colleagues. A study in Nature found that papers by female authors are cited less frequently than identical work under male names, mirroring how Byzantine physician Metrodora's medical texts were later credited to anonymous. Even the language of dismissal is eerily consistent. Ancient Rome called assertive women shrill, while today's headlines label female leaders bossy or emotional. These aren't coincidences, they're proof that bias evolves rather than vanishes. Yet history also offers blueprints for resistance. The loom, once dismissed as women's work, funded entire economies, just as the undervalued caregiving labor of today, from nursing to childcare, sustains societies despite chronic underpayment. The Vestal virgins leveraged their sacred status to amass wealth and influence, a lesson for modern activists using religious or cultural platforms to advocate for change, like nuns campaigning for climate justice or indigenous women leading land rights movements. Even the Trung Sisters Rebellion holds a mirror to contemporary protests, where movements like Iran's Woman, Life, Freedom uprising prove that the demand for bodily autonomy transcends millennia. What makes these connections more than academic is their power to shape strategy. When pay equity campaigns invoke the beer and barley ledgers of Mesopotamian businesswomen, or reproductive rights activists cite ancient Egyptian contraceptive recipes, they're doing more than drawing parallels, they're weaponizing continuity. It's harder to dismiss gender inequity as a modern overreaction when receipts from 4,000 years ago document the same exploitation. And it's harder to accept slow progress when Cleopatra negotiated treaties while today's female diplomats fight for a seat at the table. This brings us to the most urgent question: what legacies are we cementing for the future? The scribes who preserved Enheduanna's poetry or Murasaki's diary made a choice, one that allows us to hear their voices centuries later. Every time we amplify an overlooked scientist, archive a grassroots organizer's oral history, or challenge biased algorithms, we're not just correcting the record. We're weaving a new tapestry where the threads of the past strengthen the fabric of the future. Because the greatest lesson from antiquity isn't that oppression was inevitable, it's that resistance was and is relentless. And that's a story worth telling in stone, in ink, and in the pixels of tomorrow. If these stories have ignited your curiosity, there's a wealth of resources waiting to deepen your understanding, starting with the Women's Museum in Aarhus, Denmark, where interactive exhibits trace female labor from Viking-age textile workshops to modern STEM fields. But don't stop there. The Dawn of Everything by David Grieber and David Wengrow reframes prehistory with fresh evidence of matrilineal societies, while Silent Women, Pioneers of Cinema uncovers the forgotten female directors of early Hollywood, a modern echo of history's selective memory. For those craving visceral connections, the Palmyra Museum in Syria, though damaged by conflict, still houses statues of Queen Zenobia with her defiant gaze intact, and the National Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C. dedicates an entire gallery to enslaved women's resistance, weaving threads between ancient and modern struggles. Dive deeper with documentaries like The Ascent of Woman, which traces female influence from Çatalhöyük's Neolithic priestesses to the political salons of Enlightenment Europe, or Secrets of the Saqqara Tomb, where Egyptologist Dr. Amira Shaheen highlights the overlooked female mummies buried with surgical tools. For a global perspective, Women of the Viking Age on PBS shatters myths with forensic evidence of female traders and warriors, while the podcast The Hidden Half explores how archaeologists are regendering artifacts, like the Moche pottery of Peru, once assumed to depict male rulers until lip plates and weaving motifs revealed priestess rulers. Seek out marginalized voices through works like Women's Work, The First 20,000 Years, which exposes how textile production bankrolled empires, or The Excluded by Anita Ann, and Chronicling Women Erased from Independence Movements. Indigenous scholars like Dr. Paulette Steeves' The Indigenous Paleolithic Challenge colonial narratives by reconstructing matriarchal societies from oral traditions and petroglyphs. And if you're drawn to hands-on discovery, digital archives like Clio Visualizing History offer letters from medieval nuns, while the Perseus Project hosts newly translated fragments of Sappho's poetry. This isn't just about filling gaps, it's about reclaiming agency. Every time you cross-reference a textbook with a primary source, or question why certain stories dominate museums while others gather dust, you're continuing the work these women began centuries ago. Because history isn't a static monument, it's a living conversation, and the most powerful tool you have is the willingness to listen, especially to the voices others tried to silence. Now that we've journeyed through these hidden lives, queens who ruled empires, priestesses who spoke with the gods, and everyday women who turned quiet resistance into an art, I want to hear your thoughts. Which story left you breathless? Was it Boudicca's fiery rebellion, or perhaps Enheduanna's hymns, etched into clay 4,000 years ago? Maybe it was the unnamed weaver whose hands fed civilizations, her name lost but her legacy woven into every thread. Drop a comment below, tell me whose life resonated most and why. And here's a challenge: if you were transported back to their world, how would you navigate the constraints they faced? Would you wield diplomacy like Cleopatra or strategy like Amanianas? Would you carve your name into history or fight from the shadows like the women who smuggled knowledge in tapestries and songs? This isn't just about looking back, it's about recognizing how these stories shape us. Every time we uncover a forgotten name, we're not just correcting the past, we're rewriting what's possible for the future. So let's keep the conversation going. Share the overlooked figures you think deserve the spotlight. The healers, the poets, the rebels who history sidelined but whose echoes still linger. Because the most powerful thing we can do with these stories isn't just remember them, it's ensure they're never erased again. And that brings us to the heart of it all. These women weren't exceptions to their time, they were proof of what their time tried to suppress. Their struggles weren't ancient history, they're mirrors reflecting battles still being fought today. The next time someone claims women's voices are a modern phenomenon, point them to the cracks in the frescoes, the gaps in the legal codes, the quiet spaces between the lines where women have always found ways to say, "We were here." We mattered, now it's our turn to listen and to amplify what they couldn't. We've traced the contours of these hidden lives not as shadows at the edges of history, but as its very architects. The hands that spun empires from silk and diplomacy, the voices that whispered prophecies and penned revolutions, the bodies that bore both the weight of oppression and the fire of resistance, they were never footnotes. They were the story, and here's the truth that still echoes. When we scrub women from the record, we don't just erase individuals, we fracture our understanding of how civilizations rise, how cultures endure, how power truly flows. The priestess who interpreted omens, the merchant who funded wars, the mother who smuggled herbal remedies across borders, they didn't just live history. They made it. The parallels to our modern world are uncanny. When a Viking woman's grave was mislabeled for a century because scholars couldn't fathom a female warrior, it's the same reflex that today dismisses women's leadership as emotional or unprecedented. When Hatshepsut's monuments were defaced to blunt her legacy, it's no different from algorithms quietly sidelining women's achievements in search results. The battles have new battlefields, courtrooms, boardrooms, digital spaces, but the war is ancient, and that's why these stories aren't relics, they're roadmaps. Every treaty negotiated by a queen, every contract signed by a widow, every hymn composed by a priestess whispers the same lesson: exclusion isn't inevitable. It's a choice, one that can be unmade. Sappho's words, scrawled on papyrus 2,600 years ago, still resonate. Someone will remember us, I say, even in another time. She wasn't just hoping, she was promising, because memory isn't passive, it's an act of defiance. Every time we reclaim a name, restore a fragment, or retell a story, we're honoring that vow. And the work isn't done. For every Hypatia or Boudicca we celebrate, there are thousands more waiting in the archives, their voices muffled but not silenced. So let's keep listening, let's keep digging, because history isn't a closed book, it's a palimpsest with layer upon layer waiting to be uncovered. Hit subscribe to join us as we keep peeling back those layers, one untold story at a time. And the next time someone claims women's influence is a modern phenomenon, you'll know exactly where to point them, not to the gaps in the record, but to the countless cracks where the light and the truth gets